Welcome to the Chris Rock Mac Show, where every week we speak about the latest trends and news in AI, and where we also engage with AI founders to talk about their ambition, their products, and what it also means for the industry and for humanity. And today, I'm really happy to welcome you, Pascal from Bardeen, here to our studio. Do you want to maybe say a couple of words about yourself?
Sure. Great to meet you all. Thanks for having me. Yeah, with Bardeen, we're really trying to build like a next generation automation software. The idea is that we're all probably familiar with this problem of having like 50 tabs open in the browser, like 20 different logos, and you end up basically finding yourself like being the router between all these different services, and you spend a lot of time like moving data between different tabs and services and so on. And that's really we think like a problem because you waste a lot of time doing that, B, you like lose your flow. And also people make mistakes, like you forget to step, like you forget like to do something that's important and so on. So what we're trying to do with Bardeen is we're trying to build a tool for everyone, for the actual people who are doing the work every day, that can use Bardeen to solve this for themselves and really create workflows and automations that make their lives easier and better. So that's kind of like the high level of what we're working on, and happy to share more over the course of the conversation.
That sounds interesting. I mean, we've spoken quite a bit about automation workflow. I think that's also where AI has essentially the biggest impact for now. Can you maybe just elaborate a little bit on like what are some of the most popular use cases? How do people use you guys, and maybe walk us through that process?
Yeah, so we're a horizontal platform, which means that between the apps that we're integrating with, and we have at this point like 80 something integrations, really like your imagination is the limit, right? So you can basically build whatever you want. Having said that, there are certain types of workflows that we see a lot of traction with. So those are your typical like outreach workflows for sales, recruiting, prospecting. So you're on someone's profile, that's a LinkedIn profile or something else. And then you basically move data to your CRM system. You write a custom outreach email. You maybe share the profile in some communication tool, Slack channel, Teams, or something with your team to take a look at. Those types of workflows are super, they're very repetitive. The more of them I do per day, the more likely I find the right candidate or sales lead or whatever. So they lend themselves very well to automation. There's also other kind of things that are more research related. So pulling data from many different sources and trying to aggregate them in some sort of database or table that I use for my own research purposes. Those are like, investment analysts, real estate, and so on. There's project management that we see a lot of traction with. So, for example, like I get bug reports in email about like things that, may or may not work in the product. And then I need to like file a ticket in our ticket system. I need to respond to the user and probably need to forward the ticket to someone on Slack to actually take a look at it. And like all those types of workflows, those lend themselves very well to automation. But again, having said that, like really like your imagination is the limit. We see like teachers using this. We see VCs, podcasters, like everyone kind of using this for certain workflows. We have actually yesterday launched something like a sales automation app that's kind of like targeted for sales and SDR kind of personas, because we believe that like, in these types of workflows, there's a lot of value to be created through automation.
So basically what I'm hearing and what I'm understanding is any sort of like news and task can be automated with you guys. So basically if I have an email, I get an attachment, I want to save it to a certain drive folder, that's basically something that I can outsource to Bardeen. Is that correct? And you were also saying that imagination is really the limit. What were like some of the most surprising ways of how people have used Bardeen?
It's a good question. I think like one thing that I thought was interesting was, people for their PhD thesis doing research work. Like we had molecular biology or something student, and they were using Bardeen to basically source structures of molecules and maintain them in a Notion database. So basically you do certain, like they had a table, Google Sheet or a Notion base, I forgot. And they were basically looking for certain names of molecules, and then they were looking up for all the different papers of those, and they wanted those papers summarized and put into that same database. I thought that was a really smart way of using it. I would have never thought about this. We have teachers using it for like, citation management and things like that. We have now like a big project with a real estate agency that's basically monitoring competitors' prices on different platforms and then adjusting their own prices based on that. Those are all things that like, honestly, I would have never thought about. When we built Bardeen, we built it for ourselves. Like both my co-founder and I, we were like engineering managers and technical managers before. So we very much built it with this like project management and hiring kind of like use cases in mind. So the first integrations we had were like Jira, Slack, like the Atlassian Suite, Notion, and so on, all the tools that we were using for ourselves. And we basically built an automation tool that we could use to literally automate our own jobs to some extent. And then when we released it, we got quite some good traction very early on. Now we have over 250,000 users on the platform. So you can imagine that with like 250,000 people, you can see all sorts of like interesting and random things in there. But yeah.
And Pascal, if we think how it works in practice, and let us take, for example, the case of here, the SDR sales. So normally like an SDR, the person will do, will go, let's say, to something like Apollo. I will say, I want to target all CTOs based in Munich, Germany, to say something. And then the person gets like this list and maybe moves the list to a Google Doc or something, and then starts the outreach on a LinkedIn. So how does this workflow translate to Bardeen? I saw that you have a Chrome plugin. So I guess the first step is to install the plugin, and what happens next?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's like two questions in your question. One is like, what's a typical user journey for Bardeen? Like how do most people find us? And the second thing is like specifically to this SDR workflow, like how could an SDR, for example, use Bardeen? So start with the first question, which is basically most users as of today find Bardeen through SEO. So we have almost 2,000 landing pages for specific workflows that are basically, let's say, for example, summarize content of a website and add it to a Notion page. And for that, we have a specific landing page that's very SEO optimized with content that when you search for something like how to automatically summarize website and add to Notion, then Bardeen will pop up somewhere on the first, second, third page on Google. And that's how we get like most people. And then you come with that very specific use case in mind. There's an onboarding flow that brings you like to that automation very quickly. And from there, now you have the Chrome extension installed. We can proactively suggest you other automations that might be useful for you, or you think about them and find them yourself. So basically, most people don't come through this, I want to install an automation tool, let me install Bardeen and then figure out where to go. They come with a very specific use case in mind through a very specialized funnel. And then that's the first starting use case. And then it's basically land and expand type motion from there, where you then discover more use cases over time. So that's the first part. Second part is for SDR specifically. Let's take this Apollo case that you were just talking about. Like I have this list in our Google Sheets that I have basically LinkedIn profiles of people. And I want to now do some research for those, people, because I want to know like what's their job title. Maybe they have a certain background or something, so I can personalize my outreach to them. Like one thing that Bardeen can, for example, help you with, it can go and visit those LinkedIn profiles for you with an agent and basically figure out like what is, let's say, Chris's educational background, what other job titles did she have in the past and so on. And then that can help me to tailor an outreach message that also Bardeen can automatically generate for you based on that input data, and then add it, say, to that Google Sheet that you now have as a second column. And now you have, enriched your Google Sheet with the outreach message. But ultimately what you want to do is you want to send an email to Chris, right? So like what Bardeen can then also do for you in the same workflow, it can actually like put a draft email in your Gmail outbox folder that already has Chris's email populated and the message that we just generated and maybe some custom title. So that you as the SDR now, all you have to do is basically, generate your lead list, your long list basically, then run Bardeen through that. And then now you have a bunch of like draft emails in your inbox that you will probably still want to review because, let's be honest, with generative AI these days, like there are still some funny things that happen every now and then. And they hallucinate things in emails and so on, but we try to make it as accurate as possible, but we will still recommend to like review, especially if it's important, high touch sales that you're doing. Like you would basically only review the draft emails, make some minor changes if necessary, and then like hit send like, a million times and you're done. So that would be an example for like a workflow that we can automate for SDRs. And the way you can think about Bardeen here is we're really kind of like the glue between the different platforms and the workflows that you're doing already, right? Like we're not the tool to send emails. You have email for that, like Gmail or whatever. We're not the tool to, get data about a person, like you have Apollo, LinkedIn, Clearbit, and so on. But we bring all of them together and let you tailor them into like a special workflow that meets your needs and lets you basically automate that specific workflow. So you can think about Bardeen much more like a pipeline than like solving a specific problem. And then we can pipe all the different tools together and make it much smoother and automatic for you.
This type of workflow automation, this is a concept that has been around for already some time. And I can think of, let's say, Tray.io, and this idea of I have this canvas and I drag and drop nodes that have some tasks and actions. And then in the end, I can create exactly this pipeline where I start with some objective and I end up with the final result. What's the difference between this traditional way on how to automate workflows and what Bardeen offers?
Yeah, so I think the way I think about the automation industry, you have kind of these two big clusters of apps. You have the, iPaaS, what I would call like intelligent platform, like intelligent automation platforms. So that's your Zapier, Tray.io, Make.com, hundreds of other apps that essentially, if you boil it down, they are like no-code builders that connect backend APIs together. So it's like an abstraction layer on all these APIs. Essentially, what they allow you to automate is these like if this then that type workflows. So there's something that triggers something, like you get a new lead in your Salesforce leads or something like that, and now you want to like trigger some action in like one or two other apps. And that you can do with any of these tools, right? Like it's a very commoditized like solution these days. Pick your depending on if you're more technical, you would go with more like a Make.com or Tray.io or Kato. If you're like more of an SMB type user, you'd go more for like a Zapier or maybe if this and that or some solution like that. So that's kind of one part of the solution. The other part of the solution is this like RPA industry. So it's like UiPath, automation anywhere, many vendors like this. And they're much more focused on context automation. So like they move the mouse and fill the field for you. They don't leverage APIs as much, but they're more like in this context. Now, what we're trying to do with Bardeen is we're really trying to bring the best of both worlds together. If you really think about like a holistic automation solution, is you want to leverage APIs where it makes sense, but you also want to be able to interact with services that don't have APIs, where you can't do that, and bring them into your context. So the way Bardeen is designed is we have API integrations with most of the services that we're integrating with, but we also have these like agent capabilities that can interact with the screen for you. And as you mentioned before, we are browser extensions, so we are in your context. We see the screen that you can see. We have access to the tabs you have open. Like we have all this kind of contextual information that you would typically get from an RPA player. But at the same time, we have API integrations and so on that you would typically see in an iPaaS platform. So we kind of bring the best of both worlds together. And that allows us to automate a lot more complex workflows that are typically impossible to do with like an Zapier or Tray.io or something like this. Even the example that we just talked about before with your lead list that you got from Apollo and so on. Like I would encourage you to try to automate that like in a Tray or a Zapier. Like I wouldn't know how to do it there. Same is true for like the more enterprise heavy platforms. They also lack some of the certain capabilities. So we really just try to bring the best of both worlds together and like build on the learnings that both of them had over the last 10 or so years. And really try to build the next generation of this.
Very, very interesting. And also you're sort of like trying to like integrate everything together. And you were describing this from a technical point of view. Maybe if we were to focus on more the user experience perspective, in what way are you guys different from other solutions? How do people interact? And what is sort of also maybe the vision or the roadmap here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So ultimately for Bardeen, our vision is to empower everyone to be an automator. Like if you think about, again, the existing universe of apps, either like you work at a Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 company and they have the money to bring like a McKinsey, Capgemini, you name it, in to implement an RPA project. And then, great, you have access to like those automations and so on. But lo and behold, if your workflow changes, now you have to go through like the center of excellence, make these changes, blah, blah, blah. It's a huge process. Or you are more technical and you have access to tools like Tray.io, Zapier, and so on, and you can set it up yourself, or you have someone in your team who's technical to do this. But the reality is like most of us, we're not in those two categories, but we still have workflows that we would want to automate, and we still have a lot of things that can benefit from automation. And that's really the 98% of us that like we're trying to target with Bardeen. Now, if you want to do that, you have to bring a really intuitive and easy interface, because you can't rely on people who know how to code. You can't even show JSON, like JavaScript notation or something like this, because a lot of people who are technical, they get scared. Like the moment they see curly braces, they're like, brain switches off and they're like, oh my God, like I don't know what to do with this. And that's really what we're trying to optimize for with Bardeen. And the way we do this is our interface is purely language based. So the way I build an automation in Bardeen, if I have to build an automation, because again, we have built a lot of the most common workflows, everything we've seen in our user group as we talk to users, we do like many user studies every week, and we learn like what are the workflows that people typically do, and we just build them for them. And we ship them with the product. They're already pre-built available for you. And all you need to do is do like a little bit of configuration. And again, like no JSON involved, like everything's kind of abstracted away from you. You just may need to like log in with your whatever Gmail or Salesforce account and you're done. So that's kind of like the best possible user experience. So it's like you do not need to build anything. Now, the reality is a lot of people there's a very long, like workflows are very long tail distributed, right? So like there's a few things that all of us do. Again, those we have pre-built, like you're good. But then like I might use Notion as a database. You use Airtable, and like Word uses Google Sheets. essentially we're doing the same thing, but again, you can't give the same workflow to us because it wouldn't work for all three of us, right? So you need to be able to configure them and make them kind of changeable in an easy way. And that's why we bring a language interface. And thanks to the amazing advances that we all know about with language models these days, it actually becomes possible to build and edit these automations purely language driven. So the way you do it in Bardeen is you literally just describe it. I would say, like, Chris, you made this example earlier about, like, every time I get an email, I want to save the attachment of that email in a specific Google Drive folder, and that should be dependent on what type of email attachment it is, right? If it's in an invoice, it goes into the invoice folder. If it's like a picture, it just go into like a picture folder. And if it's a pitch deck, it should go into a pitch deck folder. And I can just describe this in Bardeen. I can just say, like, every time I get an email, like, save the attachment in Google Drive, based on the type of the email. If a folder doesn't exist, create a new folder. But more often than not, again, language technology is not perfect. We're still building this out. Like, I don't want to, promise the universe here, but more often than not, Bardeen will correctly identify the intent of the automation and actually demonstrate and show me, like, the pre-built workflow that, will be anywhere from 80 to 100% correct. And then I can go in and tweak it in an easy to use way. And again, this is kind of an interface that we see teachers can use, students can use that are not technical, like people that don't have a technical background or don't have the resources to hire consultants can actually use to build and maintain their own automations. Now, if I had to predict the future, I think there's first of all, this will become better, right? As language models become better, we learn more, we get more training data, we can train our models better, we can just make the whole user experience better. So over time, it will keep getting easier. And then second thing, my favorite project in the company that we're working on today is making it so that you don't even have to describe what you're automating. Again, we sit in the browser, so we see what you're doing. We see, like, and again, by see, I don't mean like we actually see, but the browser extension sees. We do not communicate any of this data to the backend, but the browser extension actually sees, like, oh, Chris is copy pasting data from a conference website to a Google Sheet, and the type of data she's copying is like names of speakers. Then when she has them in the Google Sheet, now she uses Apollo to figure out, like, what's the email address and sends them an outreach email to, schedule them for a podcast interview, for example. Like, the vision that we have is that Bardeen would basically understand the intent of what you're trying to do and then proactively suggest this to you and be like, hey, Chris, I understand you're trying to, get the speakers from the conference website, enrich their information and send them an outreach email to schedule a podcast interview. Let me just take care of this for you. And I think then you really unlock automation for everyone. And that's ultimately, I think, the holy grail if you think about, like, the automation industry, and this is something we're working towards. So yeah, that would be, I think, the perfect, if there's anything like a perfect user experience, and I think it's like you don't have to ask for anything, it just proactively comes to you.
There is almost this meme from, or every time there's a new announcement from OpenAI, you see all over social media, it says, now thousands of startups will die because they've been replaced by this new functionality of OpenAI, the so-called team wrappers on GPT and so on. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think, so there's a threat from big companies such as Google, OpenAI, and so on, that every time they release features, they pretty much replace startups? Do you think there's space for startups in all this innovation wave, or where's the place of startups in the ecosystem?
I mean, I think this has always been true. I think if you're building something on someone else's platform and your value proposition is a thin wrapper, always you are gonna be dead by default soon, right? Like, I mean, we've seen this with, even like social media platform days, like people were building apps on Facebook, and then obviously Facebook is going to release that as a feature because clearly people want it and they have huge engineering teams. So why would they just not do it themselves, right? So, like, I think, and same is true for Google and any other platform that was built in the last 50 years. So I think that the space for startups as we create more technology platforms like this actually grows. I think as a company, you have to think harder about what's your separation, what's your differentiated advantage, and how are you going to build something that actually long-term provides value that isn't just going to be, absorbed by the big platforms. I don't even think that's a bad, I know, like, OpenAI does not go out. Like, I know for a fact, like, Sam does a lot of investments in companies. He's very well incentivized for the startup ecosystem to work out well. Like, he for sure does not go out like, how do I kill as many startups as possible with the next release? Like, it just happens that if you're building a company that doesn't really provide any value, that, like, of course, like, you're not going to survive. Like, that's just fundamentally, I think, like, the way startups and value creation works. Having said that, I think if you actually look at the startups that have been created and grown over the last 2 or 3 years in the GPT times, there's a lot of amazing companies that have been built very quickly, very efficiently, are creating completely different services that I don't think are at the risk or have been, absorbed by any of the big platforms. And I think, if anything, the fact that those big platform companies are building better and better models enables the startup ecosystem. Again, if you take the right approach, if you just create a very thin wrapper or little tool to solve X problem that is hard to differentiate in, then of course you kind of set yourself up for failure. And you're basically throwing yourself in the swimming lane of this huge tanker that's moving forward anyway. It's like they're not going to do it because of you or despite you, like they're moving in this direction whether you're there or not. And if you just like put yourself right in front of it, then you're like that's your own mistake, right? But if you kind of like put yourself in a position where you can like surf the wake, from the big tankers moving, then you're winning. So I think that's maybe the thing to think about. And every founder I talk to, I interact with, I would always challenge them to predict, like, what are the risks? And as a founder, I think that's part of your job, is to think about like, where do you see the, big tankers in your industry moving? Where's the intersections of them, and what's the blank space and the problems that they are probably not going to solve, and where you can create differentiated value.
And the image that comes up in my mind on that, and I think you referred to nature before, is it is kind of like an ecosystem, right? It's like a natural ecosystem. And the question is always like, should the big tankers, as you call them, go after the kind of niche that you're focusing on? And most often they do not have the capacity, they do not care about it, and they actually build upon the many, many startups that are going into the space. And I think it's a natural equilibrium, so to speak. And so that is why I personally don't think that now Google will copy you guys, but rather they will wait for you guys to be successful, or whoever is going to be successful in the space, and collaborate or potentially even buy. And I think that's just how things work. And I don't see why this would now diverge from this kind of like almost natural law.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think like there's the thing with big companies, and like, I've seen this from the inside, is like there's a huge inertia to do anything new, right? So like, referring to Google, like for Google to start any project that they're not going to kill a few months in, like, Google was famous for like starting a million different things and then killing them very quickly. Like, if you think about it from their point of view, it has to be a $10 billion business from the get-go for it to even make sense to think about. Otherwise, it's just like rounding error. Why do we even think about this? Like, let's focus resources on things that actually matter and move the needle. So like, if you as a company, as a startup company, you can think about this very differently. Like, going after something that will create 100 million ARR in a few years as a startup is an amazing outcome. Like, you're crushing it, you're a unicorn very likely, like you're going really well. But that's something that like a Google or Meta or whatever, they wouldn't care about this. Like, not because they don't care about the market, because at their size and scale, it doesn't physically make sense to go after it. So like, I think that type of strategy always makes sense. So, famous, they can go after niche and then expand from there. And I think as a founder, again, it's kind of your job to think about it that way. Like, if you're going after something that's like, like I wouldn't start a company today that like optimizes ad spending on search. Like, that's Google's problem. Like, they're spending tens of billions on optimizing this. They have hundreds of thousands of like amazing, the best engineers in the world working on this. Like, who am I to come? Like, like I think highly of myself, but like, I'm not going to win against them, like, and like, yet you see a lot of founders like thinking like this, and like, I can beat Google and do this. It's like, okay, like you can try, like maybe there's a like minuscule chance you can do it. And if you actually do, then like, kudos to you, like amazing. But you're very much setting yourself up for failure. And this is also with this like dev tool ecosystem that you talked about with OpenAI releases, that like, if they're like, of course, OpenAI is they're like the leading platform company right now for developers to build large language models. Of course, they're incentivized to make it easier for people to build large language models. If you now build a tool that makes it easier for developers to build large language models, there's hundreds of engineers at OpenAI thinking about this exact problem. They have the user data, they have the distribution. I don't think you can win against them, So, and then people go like, oh, they've just killed 100 startups. It's like, no, they haven't. Like, the startups killed themselves by like going after a problem that was obviously going to be solved by one of the big players. So I think that's kind of how I would think about it.
Thinking from the user perspective, something I see is that most people struggle trying to write down their thoughts, really to put into word form what they want. And then we're mentioning the Bardeen interface. It is pretty much free form based. Which advice do you have to them? How can they make best use of Bardeen, or in general, any type of interface that is text-based? How can they structure it in a manner that makes sense? How can they maximize whenever they're working with Bardeen?
Yeah, so I think, this is true for both Bardeen and other interfaces that I see. Is like, most of these language-based interfaces, again, they're using transformer models underneath, and transformer models fundamentally work on like a semantic similarity basis, right? So if you give me a prompt that structurally looks like other prompts that the system has seen, the systems will likely do very well. If you give me something that's completely different, like Yoda speak, then the system is likely not going to know how to deal with it, right? So like I think the way, and this is true also with like ChatGPT prompting, right? Like there's even these like template thingies you can get online about like how to prompt ChatGPT to get the best links. And like the reason these things work is because those systems have seen a lot of certain types of input data and they've been optimized for certain things. And if you stay close or as close as possible to that type of structure of input, then, very likely the system's going to do well because it's similar to training examples that it's seen. If you try to kind of prompt it in a very different way, then it's going to be harder. So that's kind of like the general framework. In Bardeen's case specifically, the way we built this is like if your prompt is similar to a title or description of an existing automation, we will do really well because that's how the system is trained. If you describe it in a very different, like very kind of poetic way, like you're trying to describe your workflow like a poem or whatever, like system hasn't seen this. Like we don't have training data in our system that maps poem description to workflow automation, right? So like likely the system isn't going to do well. Like it may in very few cases still figure it out because these language models have, huge amount of background knowledge and training data and so on. But it's not going to do as well as if you give it like a very factual, concise description, the way that like our descriptions and system prompts are written. So I think generally speaking, that's how you want to do it. Again, specifically for Bardeen, also another thing that works best is if the automation that you're trying to build actually involves any of the integrations that we have existing integrations with, right? If you, telling us to do something with, I'll give an example like Figma and Adobe Photoshop, like we don't have integrations with either of those two. Like then the system hasn't seen any training data. We'll try to make up something, but it'll very likely not make sense or not to work right. If you're doing something that's like, sales related workflow with email and Google Drive attachments and so on, then like we will know how to deal with it. So that's kind of generally true. If you stay close to the training data and the way the system is designed, you will do much better at it versus if you try to do something very exotic.
So we spoke about use cases, we spoke about the value proposition Bardeen brings to the table. We also diverged a little bit into philosophical question on Gen AI, the future, and AI first companies. I think for the sake of the listeners, can you also share a little bit more on the business side? So for example, how does your pricing work? How, like, who's it for maybe? Are you targeting companies? Are you targeting individuals? Maybe you can shed a bit of light on that. And obviously we're also super curious to hear, how did you come up with it? Like was it one of those, napkin exercises? I think that would be really cool to know more.
It's basically a freemium subscription. So like a lot of the things on the product are still free to use. And then we have what we call premium integration. So right, if you want to integrate with your CRM system or like have an automatically generated email, so things that are clearly high value workflows that you use for work, then those are premium integrations, and there's a pay-per-use plan. So it starts at $10 a month and then scales with usage. Who is it built for? So again, as I said, like the way we built Bardeen is really, we try to make it as accessible as possible to, everyone, like, the people who are, we call it like people who are actually doing the work. But like, we're not necessarily targeting like CIOs or CTOs at a big company who then like talk to a center of excellence and set it up and then like roll it out across the organization. That's not our go-to-market motion as of today, but we want to talk to the actual person, the SDR doing the work, the recruiter doing the work, the project manager doing the work, and like solve the problem for them. And then the go-to-market motion is that there's a team space. So you can basically, if you're one SDR and you have 10 people working in your team, very likely you guys are doing the same workflow, right? Like you're probably writing to the same CRM system, you're targeting the same type of customers, like you're doing the same work. So once one of you, say Chris, like you automated the SDR work for your company, like now you would want to onboard the rest, or your manager would want to onboard the rest of the team to actually streamline the workflows. There's another value proposition where you're not only saving time and you make everyone in your team more efficient, but you also ensure consistency. Like if you're, for example, in an SDR team, it's very important that you all add the right fields to the CRM database. And like, turns out a lot of people forget to add the field, or like they add the wrong field or things like that. So by standardizing the workflows and encoding the organization knowledge in an automation, you're actually not only saving time and making people more efficient, but you're also standardizing the workflows, and you encode this organizational knowledge that makes it easier for people to onboard, makes it easier to like not forget things and so on. So that's kind of like the go-to-market motion as of today. And yeah, so that's one thing. The second question was around how did we come up with it? So as I said, like both Artem and I, we were managing kind of engineering technology teams before. And, on paper, it sounds like an amazing work. You get to like spend time with really cool technology, smart people, like it's like a dream job, But then if you actually look at the reality of how you spend your time, we both found ourselves spending a lot of time just doing like ticket management, like responding to customers, recruiting, doing interviews, doing all this like boring stuff that it's essential and critical to do the work. Yeah, like it's critical, like you cannot not do it. But that's not why you do the job. Like you do the work for like other reasons, like you want to write the code or you want to have the brainstorming discussions or you want to do the creative part of the work. And we all kind of tried many other tools, like I spent a lot of time with Zapier and UiPath and other products to actually solve the problems for me, but none of them quite cut it for the specific workflows that we had. So it's actually quite funny because we both independent from each other came up with this idea of like a me.ai or mini-me that was basically an agent that was supposed to replace ourselves for certain parts of the job. And we actually both independently to the same friend of ours pitched the idea, who then put us in touch. And then it was this romantic love at first sight kind of date where we were completing each other's sentences. And we're like, oh yeah, and it should be a Chrome extension. Yes, because that's where we spend all of our time and all the new, services, our web apps and so on. So kind of like a very interesting discussion in the beginning. I think we were both a little bit like, oh my God, like it's my competitor and so on. But then at some point we, got to know each other over a few months and we decided to build a company together. And it's been a great journey ever since. The way we make decisions, there's very much like first principles informed. Again, like we kind of look at like what worked for other companies. Again, we talked about this before, like this analysis of what exists in the automation market. What are the gaps? Like what actually works for users, talk to actual users, put, Figmas in front of them, get feedback as early as you can. And really just kind of like try to iterate towards something that is ultimately like the easiest to use automation tool that like every knowledge worker out there can use. And that's really kind of how we approach this.
And Pascal, do you have any predictions for the here automation market that might happen in the next couple of years? Where do you see the automation space headed?
That's a tough one. I mean, I have manifestations, I would say. I think ultimately, I believe that the right thing to do is to automate automation. Like, as Chris, I think, said earlier, like, it's kind of this term that we use all the time, and it's kind of like a moving goalpost. But I think the ultimate goal is to increase efficiency and remove friction from people's workflows, right? So if you can do that in an easy to use, intuitive way where I don't have to have cognitive load and where automation itself isn't like a chore, then I think people will adopt it much faster. And ultimately, I think there's huge amounts of value to be unlocked. I mean, depending on which, study from McKinsey or whoever you read, anywhere from 20 to 60% of time of knowledge workers can be more or less automated. So if you think about this from, society point of view, like that, you basically double the workforce, like double the productivity, in the optimistic scenario of like all of society. And then you can think about like, okay, what are all the amazing things people can now do with it? We can, spend more time actually writing code and having brainstorming discussions, and the whole field will move much faster. So I think that's kind of like from a high level point of view, our motivation is to really like unlock human productivity and make people more productive, that then you can achieve more in other fields. And, ultimately, I think the best way to do it is by making it like super, super simple and ultimately automating automation. So that would be my manifestation for it, like how exactly it will play out. Like we're doing our best to make it happen, but no one, I think, can really predict the future.
And I can totally resonate with your statement on you sign up for a role, but then you end up 80% of your time doing admin or all the things you don't sign up for. And I think this would be really, really cool if Bardeen or the entire automation industry could solve for that. And maybe, I don't even know if we need a COO then. Maybe that role is actually going to be redundant, but we'll see. Anyways, I think super interesting conversation. I think we spent quite a bit of time already on various topics. If people want to get in contact with you, how can they best reach you before we wrap up?
I mean, first of all, I would say like Bardeen product is Bardeen.ai. Just like play around with it, try the Chrome extension. Super excited to hear feedback. We're always looking to learn like what are the things you want to automate, what are the things we can do, where can we improve the user experience. Always eager to learn. And then to get in touch with me, it's either LinkedIn or Twitter are the easiest. I don't know if you can put the links in the show notes or something. That'd probably be the easiest way to find it.
Of course. Very cool. Thank you so much, Pascal, for coming and for sharing a little bit on Bardeen. And see you very soon, maybe.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Great conversation.
Great to have you.